It wasn't a stage. It wasn't a microphone. It wasn't a crowd screaming his name. It was a quiet room, and a sentence Freddie Mercury never thought he'd say out loud. I don't think I can do this anymore. Not because he had stopped loving music. Not because he had run out of talent. But because music, the thing that saved him, was starting to feel like the thing that was killing him. That day, Freddie didn't just question a song. He questioned his entire life. What pushed him to that edge? Who was in the room when he cracked? And what happened in the minutes after he almost walked away from everything? Subscribe and stay with this story, because the most shocking moment in a legend's life isn't always a scandal. Sometimes it's the moment they almost quit. The morning was too quiet. Not peaceful, just empty in a way Freddie Mercury hated. Silence usually meant rest. Privacy. A break from the world's hunger. But this silence felt like abandonment. Freddie sat alone, staring at a piano that suddenly looked less like an instrument and more like a responsibility. The room was familiar, yet foreign, as if something in him had shifted overnight and the objects around him hadn't gotten the memo. He should have been excited. There was always something to do. A note to chase. A vocal line to perfect. A melody to pull out of thin air and turn into something immortal. That was his gift. His addiction. But today, nothing moved inside him. No spark. No hunger. Only fatigue, deep and oddly personal, like the exhaustion wasn't in his muscles but in his identity. Freddie ran a hand through his hair, then stared at his fingers as if they belonged to someone else. The thought arrived quietly, without drama. What if I can't do it again? He hated that thought immediately. Pushed it away like he pushed away every fear. Freddie was not built for surrender. He had trained himself to outshine weakness, to overpower doubt with style and volume and brilliance. But doubt didn't leave. It sat there. Patient. Freddie walked to the window. The world outside was moving. People had places to be, lives to live, problems that had nothing to do with whether a song was good enough to survive history. That world felt strangely real. And Freddie felt strangely tired of being Freddie. He thought about the expectations, the invisible contract he had signed with the public the moment he became larger than life. Every performance had to be bigger. Every song had to mean something. Every note had to prove that the legend was still alive. But legends don't get to have quiet mornings. Legends don't get to wake up empty. Freddie turned back to the piano, sat again, and pressed a single key. The sound filled the room, pure, honest. Normally, that sound would ignite something in him. Today it didn't. He tried again. A chord. Another. A small progression. His hands moved correctly, but his heart didn't follow. That was the first time Freddie felt afraid. Not of failure. Of disconnection. Because when music stops reaching you, what's left? Freddie stared at the piano like it had betrayed him, then realized the truth was worse. It hadn't betrayed him. It was waiting for him. And he was the one who wasn't showing up. He stood, restless, pacing again. He could hear old crowds in his head, the thunder of applause, the chanting, the demand. That noise had once fed him. Now it felt like pressure. Freddie realized something painful. He didn't want to be a machine that produced greatness on command. He wanted to be a person. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure those two things could coexist. He leaned against the wall, eyes closed, breathing shallow. And then, almost as a whisper, he said the words that shocked even him. I don't think I can do this anymore. The room didn't respond. No applause. No comfort. No interruption. Just silence. And Freddie Mercury, the man who had built a life out of sound, was forced to face a terrifying possibility. That he might walk away from music, not because he stopped loving it. but because he couldn't survive what it demanded from him anymore. The pressure didn't arrive all at once. That was the cruel part. It accumulated slowly, disguised as success, as expectation, as loyalty to something he had helped build from nothing. Freddie Mercury didn't wake up one day crushed by the weight of music. He had been carrying it for years, smiling while it pressed deeper into his chest. That morning, as he moved through the house, he felt it everywhere. In the unfinished melodies. In the unanswered calls. In the quiet knowledge that people were waiting for him to deliver something extraordinary, again. Freddie had become the axis around which everything rotated. The band, the business, the legacy. When he was inspired, things moved. When he hesitated, everything stalled. That kind of dependence doesn't feel like honor forever. Eventually, it feels like captivity. Freddie understood that he wasn't just expected to make music, he was expected to be music. To embody brilliance on demand. To feel deeply, endlessly, publicly, without exhaustion. But exhaustion had arrived anyway. He thought about the last few months, how often he'd forced himself into the studio when his mind wasn't ready. How often he'd ignored the quiet signals telling him to slow down. He had trained himself to override those signals. Discipline had become reflex. And reflex had become a cage. There was also the unspoken pressure of comparison, not with others, but with himself. Every new song had to compete with the ghosts of past triumphs. Every performance had to justify the myth. Freddie didn't fear critics. He feared repetition. He feared becoming a version of himself that no longer surprised him. He felt trapped between two unbearable possibilities. Keep going and lose himself, or stop and betray everything he had built. That trap tightened when he thought about the people around him. The expectations they didn't voice but carried nonetheless. The unspoken agreement that Freddie would always find a way, because he always had. He sat down again, hands on his knees, head lowered. For the first time, he questioned something sacred. What if I don't owe music my life? That thought felt dangerous. Almost blasphemous. Music had saved him. Given him identity. Purpose. Power. Walking away felt like ingratitude. Like erasing the very thing that made him matter. But another thought followed, quieter, but sharper. What if music is asking more than I can give? Freddie had always believed suffering was part of greatness. That pain sharpened expression. That exhaustion was the cost of transcendence. But now, he wondered if that belief had turned into self-erasure. He wasn't afraid of silence. He was afraid of becoming hollow while pretending to be full. The phone rang. He didn't answer. He let it ring until the sound stopped echoing in the room. That small act of defiance felt strange, and necessary. Freddie wasn't rejecting music in that moment. He was questioning the version of it that demanded everything and gave nothing back. The pressure didn't break him. But it bent him far enough to finally ask a question he had avoided his entire life. If I stop, who am I without the music? And that question, more than any critic or failure, terrified him. Because for the first time, walking away didn't feel like weakness. It felt like survival. The conversation wasn't planned. That was what made it dangerous. Freddie hadn't asked for advice. He hadn't signaled vulnerability. He had simply stopped pretending, and someone noticed. That alone was rare enough to make him uneasy. They sat across from each other in a room that had witnessed countless creative breakthroughs. Normally, the air there crackled with possibility. That day, it felt heavy, almost accusatory. Freddie listened at first. That was his instinct when something mattered. The words came carefully, wrapped in concern, disguised as practicality. Talk of schedules. Of commitments. Of momentum that couldn't be lost. Of how stepping away now would be a mistake. At first, Freddie nodded. He understood all of it. But then the tone shifted, subtly, almost imperceptibly. The concern hardened into expectation. The language moved from what do you need to what you must do. And Freddie felt something inside him recoil. He heard phrases that landed like chains. You can't stop now. People depend on you. This is what you're built for. Built for. As if he were a structure, not a person. Freddie felt the room shrink. The air thicken. He realized he wasn't being asked how he felt, he was being reminded of his function. And that hurt more than outright dismissal ever could. He leaned back, crossing his arms, eyes fixed on a point just past the other person's shoulder. He wasn't angry yet. He was disappointed. Because this was the moment he had feared, the moment when vulnerability was met not with care, but with obligation. He tried to explain. Carefully. Honestly. He spoke about exhaustion, not physical, but existential. About waking up feeling disconnected from the very thing that had once felt like oxygen. The response came quickly. You're overthinking it. That sentence landed like a verdict. Overthinking. As if his pain were a glitch. As if doubt were something to be corrected rather than understood. Freddie felt heat rise in his chest. Not rage, something colder. The clarity that comes when you realize the person across from you is not listening for truth, but for reassurance that nothing will change. He stopped mid-thought. Silence filled the space. Freddie realized then that if he stayed in this conversation, he would either surrender, or explode. Neither option felt honest. So he stood. Not abruptly. Not dramatically. Just decisively. I don't think you understand, he said quietly. This isn't about work. It's about whether I can still recognize myself in it. The other person looked startled, not by the words, but by the finality in his tone. Freddie felt it too. For the first time, walking away from music didn't feel hypothetical. It felt possible. The conversation ended without resolution. No raised voices. No closure. Just the uncomfortable knowledge that something fundamental had been exposed, and couldn't be unexposed. As Freddie left the room, he felt a strange mix of relief and fear. Relief that he had finally spoken honestly. Fear that honesty might cost him everything. That night, he lay awake replaying the exchange. Not with anger, with grief. He realized how easily love for art becomes ownership. How quickly passion turns into expectation. And how lonely it is to realize that when you need permission to stop, no one wants to give it. Freddie didn't quit that day. But he came closer than he ever had. Because for the first time, the pressure wasn't coming from the world. It was coming from the very thing that had once felt like home. That night felt longer than it should have. Freddie didn't turn on the lights when he arrived home. He moved through the darkness on instinct, every step familiar, every corner heavy with memory. The silence wasn't empty anymore, it was confrontational. It asked questions he had avoided his entire life. What if this ends here? He poured himself a drink, more out of habit than desire, and sat down without touching it. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened window, not the icon, not the performer, but a man stripped of certainty. Freddie thought about the first time music had made sense to him. How sound had once felt like freedom, not obligation. How singing had been expression before it became expectation. And he realized how far away that feeling was now. He walked to the piano slowly, almost reluctantly. The same instrument that had once felt like an extension of his body now felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else's life. He rested his fingers on the keys, but didn't press them. This time, he didn't force it. Instead, he asked himself something terrifyingly honest. If I never play again, who am I? The question echoed in the room. Without music, Freddie wasn't sure where his identity ended. Music had given him permission to exist loudly, to take up space, to demand attention in a world that once tried to shrink him. Walking away felt like erasing proof of his right to be here. He imagined the headlines. The disbelief. The disappointment. The assumption that he had lost his edge, his fire, his relevance. That thought should have scared him. Instead, it felt quiet. Freddie realized that fear had always been easier than emptiness. Fear at least meant something mattered. This moment felt like standing at the edge of himself, unsure whether stepping away would destroy him, or finally give him peace. He sat down on the floor, back against the piano, knees pulled close. That was when it hit him, not panic, not despair, but grief. Grief for the version of himself that believed art had to cost pain to be real. Grief for the boy who thought survival meant endurance at any cost. Freddie whispered something into the darkness. "I don't know how to do this anymore." There was no response. No sign. Just the sound of his own breathing. And for the first time, Freddie allowed himself to imagine a life where music was no longer central, not because it had failed him, but because he needed rest from carrying it. The idea scared him less than he expected. What scared him was the possibility that he might never feel this honest again if he kept going the way he was. Freddie stood slowly, wiped his face, and did something small but significant. He closed the piano lid. Not violently. Not dramatically. Just enough to signal a pause. That gesture felt heavier than any goodbye could have. He didn't make a decision that night. But he came close. Closer than anyone would ever know. Because in that quiet room, with no audience and no applause, Freddie Mercury faced the possibility that walking away from music might not be failure. It might be mercy. What stopped Freddie wasn't inspiration. That was the myth people liked to believe, that a sudden melody, a burst of creativity, or a moment of artistic clarity pulled him back from the edge. It wasn't that. What stopped him was something far quieter. The next morning arrived without ceremony. No dramatic shift in the air, no internal revelation waiting for him when he opened his eyes. Freddie woke up heavy, emotionally bruised, still unsure if the night before had been a breaking point or just another wave of exhaustion. He didn't rush out of bed. That alone was unusual. For years, movement had been his defense. If he kept going, he didn't have to sit with doubt. But now, stillness felt unavoidable, and strangely necessary. Freddie thought about the conversation from the day before. About the words that had reduced his struggle to inconvenience. About how easily his humanity had been folded into obligation. And then, unexpectedly, his mind drifted backward, not to success, not to applause, but to beginnings. To the first time his voice had surprised him. To the feeling of singing not to impress, but to release. Freddie realized something painful and clarifying at the same time. Music hadn't betrayed him, people had tried to own it. They had wrapped it in expectation, turned it into a machine, demanded consistency from something that had always been alive. And Freddie had allowed that to happen. Not because he was weak, but because he cared. He understood then that quitting music entirely would mean surrendering it to the very forces that had distorted it. Walking away wouldn't reclaim himself, it would abandon a part of him that still mattered deeply. But continuing exactly as before wasn't an option either. That was the real decision point. Freddie didn't need to choose between music and himself. He needed to redefine the relationship. He stood and walked back to the piano, slowly, without pressure. This time, he didn't sit immediately. He rested his hand on the closed lid, grounding himself in the physical reality of it. When he finally opened it, he didn't chase brilliance. He pressed a single note. And listened. The sound didn't demand anything from him. It didn't ask him to be legendary. It didn't measure his worth. It simply existed. Freddie felt his shoulders drop slightly. That was it. Not inspiration, permission. Permission to make music without needing it to prove anything. Permission to pause when needed. Permission to stop performing happiness and start listening to himself again. He understood now that quitting wasn't strength. But neither was self-destruction disguised as dedication. The decision he made that morning wasn't dramatic enough to be remembered by history. But it was the most important one of his career. He wouldn't walk away from music. But he would stop letting it erase him. That choice didn't solve everything. It didn't remove pressure overnight. But it gave him something he hadn't felt in a long time. Agency. And with it, the quiet certainty that music could still be a home, as long as he was allowed to breathe inside it. Freddie didn't return to music the same way he had left it. That was the quiet truth no one outside the room would ever notice. From the outside, things looked familiar enough, the voice still powerful, the presence still commanding, the performances still electrifying. History would record continuity. But inside, something fundamental had shifted. Freddie Mercury stayed not because he owed music anything, but because he reclaimed ownership of it. He stopped confusing devotion with self-sacrifice. He understood now that staying didn't mean surrendering himself to expectation. It meant choosing, consciously, how much of himself he was willing to give, and when to pull back. That distinction saved him. Freddie began listening differently, not just to melodies, but to his own limits. He allowed himself to step away without guilt. To say no without explanation. To protect the fragile space where creativity lived instead of exploiting it. The change wasn't loud. But it was permanent. He no longer chased the feeling of being indispensable. He no longer tried to outrun doubt with excess. He let uncertainty exist without interpreting it as failure. That night, the one where he almost walked away, became a reference point he carried silently. Whenever pressure mounted, whenever voices tried to claim ownership over his talent, he remembered the closed piano lid. The stillness. The permission he had given himself to pause. Freddie stayed because he realized something essential. Music didn't need him to suffer to be real. It needed him to be honest. And honesty required rest, boundaries, and the courage to disappoint expectations that no longer aligned with his well-being. He didn't become softer on stage. But he became truer off it. He learned that legends aren't destroyed by stepping back, they're destroyed by refusing to. That survival isn't weakness. That walking away temporarily can be an act of devotion, not abandonment. Freddie Mercury didn't quit music that day. But he quit letting it consume him unchecked. And that choice, invisible, undocumented, uncelebrated, allowed him to continue creating with intention instead of fear. The world never knew how close it came to losing him. But the music that followed carried something new, a quiet resilience, a deeper breath, a man who had stared into the possibility of silence and chosen sound again on his own terms. That was the day Freddie almost walked away from music forever. And it was the day he finally learned how to stay.